Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, fans of the sequential art from all around the world. This is Chuck Dixon, and this is where you get to come ask me questions. And who am I? I'm a seasoned comic book professional of almost 4 decades of working in the graphic novel medium, as comic book snobs refer to it. But basically, you get to ask me questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Hey, I've asked you in recent weeks to subscribe, and it's really made a dramatic difference in the number of views and the number of subscribers, obviously. So the more people subscribe, the more people hear about the channel, the larger this little community of ours grows, and the more people I can reach, which makes me happier. So it's really made a difference. So if you have subscribed, thank you. If you haven't, don't blame yourself. It's because I haven't been reminding you. Okay? It's my fault more people haven't subscribed. I started in the last couple of weeks reminding people to subscribe, and they did it. And it's made a huge difference. It's a geometric growth. It's like a spread of a vampire colony, if you want to get romantic about it. Are you looking at My Sister Supreme at Arctoons? You should be. Anthony Gonzalez Clark is doing an awesome job on this strip. I write it, but he really brings the funny. And we'll have some new episodes up. Also, I've joined the Rook Reverse, as everyone has heard. Eric's got a big reach, so there's hardly any comic book fans who don't know that I have joined the Rook Reverse, and we'll be drawing Alpha Core, a graphic novel, first in a series of minis, 90-page graphic novel. And it is drawn by Joe Bennett, as we can now disclose. And it is drawn. He's completely finished with this project, and we're working on a second project featuring a new character in the Rippaverse, created by Joe and I, that Eric has kindly let us play with in his big old comic book sandbox. So Alpha Core #1, me and Joe Bennett, knocking it out of the park. Joe is doing awesome work on this, as he always does. Here's a guy that never phones it in. So that was the big announcement recently. And let's get to our questions. Ace Mowick, were you a fan of Wild Wild West? What did you think of how it blended genres to keep people's interest, since Westerns had been losing popularity at the time? And do you think it could have done more to go a little longer? Yeah, I liked Wild Wild West. I still like it. I'll watch an episode every now and again, and it's kind of fun. It had its charm. It had its own sense of humor. It was, basically self-aware of, how preposterous the idea of the show was, and I had some fun with that. And I remember when it first came on, when it first premiered, I didn't see it. It was on Friday nights, and when you were a kid, sometimes you missed shows on Friday nights because you had to go grocery shopping with your parents or whatever. But I remember my dad got to see it, and when I got home, I asked him, about it, and he said, "Well, you'd like it," which meant he didn't. And the thing about Wild Wild West was it was an obvious effort to because the Western TV genre was falling away. And the spy genre had shown up, and everything was about spies. You had Bond Mania, and you had all these spy television shows. And so it was a natural assumption that a spy Western would get viewers, and it did. It did for many, many seasons. In fact, it was one of the last regular Westerns, one of the last long-running Westerns, other than like Gunsmoke, on the air, and also definitely the last spy show. Most of the spy shows, because the spy craze ended overnight, most of the spy shows were canceled seasons before Wild Wild West ended. So whoever came up with this idea turned out to be brilliant. And the reason why it didn't go on any longer, the real reason is because they clamped down on television violence. And Wild Wild West was all about shooting and brawling and fighting and chases and all that stuff. Lots and lots of stunt work. And the show's creators, along with Robert Conrad, felt they couldn't do the show under the new restrictions. It just wouldn't be the same Wild Wild West. It certainly wouldn't be as wild. So they stopped producing it. for that reason. Now, in the 70s, they made a couple of TV movies that were actually really good and got big viewership. And I don't know quite why they didn't continue doing them. Robert Conrad was a real busy guy. Robert Conrad's probably had, I don't know if he holds the record for one actor being featured in more TV series than anybody else, but he was certainly prolific, and he was always in demand by TV producers. So maybe they didn't make any more Wild Wild West movies for TV because he was simply too busy doing other things. And there you have it. Johnny Van Ham. Hey, Chuck, I was curious to hear your thoughts on the newer Bat Family characters of Red Hood and Damien Wayne. Well, Damien Wayne, he was a thorn in our side in the Bat offices for the entire time I was there. He was created as part of, what was it called? Son of the Demon? It was a graphic novel. Boy, I forget who wrote it. It might have been Mike Barr, but I know Jerry Bingham drew it. And it was one of the first of the DC graphic novels. Everybody was doing large, oversized graphic novels at the time. And it was never supposed to be canon. It was never supposed to be part of continuity. It was just sort of a one-off Batman adventure in which he has a kid. And we spent years trying to ignore it. But, fans were like, well, where's his son? What about his son? When's his son going to come back? It's not in continuity, okay? But nobody could get that. I mean, we had a hard enough time working Jim Gordon's son out of the out of the continuity, ignoring that one, which was something that happened before Denny took over the Batman offices. So yeah, he's been kind of a pain in the butt. Red Hood, I don't know much about. I don't even know who Red Hood is. I don't follow current Batman continuity, which meaning I haven't followed the Batman continuity in 20 years. So I don't know who the Red Hood is. I do know they keep adding characters to the Batman family, which I think is problematic because Batman is primarily a solitary figure. Robin and Alfred are certainly enough. Addition of Batgirl, especially in the form of Barbara Gordon as Oracle, I think fits. I'm guilty of bringing the Huntress into Batman continuity, but I thought that she was a good fit because she was never going to be part of the Batman family. She was like a vigilante, a masked vigilante who was unauthorized by Batman, often resented by Batman, often worked in conflict or in contrast to his goals. I thought that made for a lot of drama. And plus the idea of a former mafia princess who's now a rooftop climbing crime fighter. There's a lot of appeal there. So I did not regret growing the Bat family to include her. Alan Barebi. If Bane was supposed to be like Doc Savage but evil, do you think the Venom might be diminishing how great he is? Imagine if he beat Batman without it, then he really would be an evil Doc Savage. Yeah, I mean, drug addiction doesn't really enhance your life, does it? And he certainly is addicted to the Venom. It's part narcotic, it's part human growth serum, it's growth hormones, it's steroids, it's this toxic mix of crap that increases his strength. And he is diminished without it. I remember Graham and I did a story where we show him after he's been imprisoned and he's no longer on Venom, and he's gotten flabby and out of shape and pudgy. And that's what happens when you are using these growth hormones and steroids and things. You throw your metabolism and your hormone balance all out of whack. And the effects are really bad when you stop taking it. Not as bad as when you are taking it physically, but it's going to affect you the rest of your life. So yeah, I mean, if he could have beaten Batman without the aid of Venom, and I think he could have. I mean, he had it all. He is Batman's physical and intellectual equal, but he's a criminal, and he wanted to have that edge. We saw it in the Nightfall, where he basically drove Batman to exhaustion in order to increase that edge. He's ruthless. This is a guy who rose to the top of the food chain in a prison, in a third world hellhole prison. So he's not going to fight fair, and he's going to take any advantage he can, even if it's one that's deleterious to his own health and reputation. Another Alan Barabi question. Spoiler is also one of my favorites. In fact, you did a great job with all of Tim's girlfriends and women he had relationships with. What did you see as her future ending up as? Maybe a trainee with the Birds of Prey? Yeah, I mean, if I was going to stay on the book forever, stay a part of the Batman universe forever, I was going to bring Spoiler to the attention of Oracle and eventually make her, a sometime agent. I mean, if you read Birds of Prey, you know that Oracle reached out to various people within the DCU for help if she needed their particular talents. Birds of Prey was very much a kind of a Mission Impossible approach to the superhero genre. The idea being that Oracle, with her reach into the superpower metahuman community in the DCU, she could tap various people to help with various missions, and it wasn't always women. If you read the series, you know that. But yeah, I mean, I had once it was established that the fans loved Stephanie Brown and wanted to keep her around, I came up with plans. I've discussed in other videos how I wanted to make her stand in for Robin for a 6-month run, which they did after I left DC. But I had a more, I don't know, I had more of a motive and more of a reason for that to happen than what they did. They just basically did a stunt, whereas I made it part of a larger fabric of a bigger story. But yeah, I had plans. I want to keep her around. I really like the character. I've often said of all the characters I've ever created, I had the most affinity for Stephanie Brown. She felt the most real in my head, if that doesn't sound completely nuts. I should have put your twin spin earlier, Alan, but you got a twin spin. So better late than never, as we say in the twin spin offices. Actually, you got a triple spin, didn't you? Oh, man, I just screwed this all up, didn't I? One of my favorite side relationships was Renee and Harvey. Renee Montoya and Harvey Bullock. And how they were not stereotypes, a big loudmouth, crude slob male and a lesbian, and yet they were great together and cared for each other. Well done there, and far better than the usual woke depictions. Well, I mean, I didn't make it all about Harvey being a slob, and I certainly didn't make it all about Renee being a lesbian. I think that you shortchange the characters and you create a stereotype. It's demeaning to everybody to just make a character all about one thing. Yes, Harvey was a slob, and he cut corners, but he was also a smart guy. We can assume he wasn't the most pleasant person in the world to be around, but sometimes you need a son of a bitch to do a job. And he was certainly serious about his work. And, the same for Renee Montoya. I mean, I like how, and this wasn't just me doing this. This was decision within the Batman universe, within the Batman offices, is that we introduced Montoya as a uniform cop and then elevated her to detective status, as, offering her promotion after promotion as she earned them through merit, through various things she did within the series. But yeah, I liked both these characters, and I liked writing them together because they contrasted so perfectly, both in appearance and personality, that I thought it made an interesting mix. Kane Dorr. I've really been enjoying Levon Cade's adventures as audiobooks, my preferred medium over the last couple of decades, and I have a question. Are you purposely crafting each book to kind of feel like a chapter of an issue in an ongoing? And do you plan on having the daughter also be a gun-toting vigilante or sidekick in the coming books? It's funny that you say that they read like my comic work, which I'm taking as a compliment. I think you mean it as a compliment. I'm going to pretend you mean it as a compliment. That the books have the same fast-paced forward momentum as my comic work. And you're not the first person to point that out. When I wrote my first Levon book, Levon's Trade, I sent it to Scott Peterson before I sent it to the publishers because I thought he might be interested in taking a look at it. And he said that I had finally done it. I'd written maybe 8 novels up to this point. And he said I had finally wedded my comic book writing style to my prose writing style. then they both very naturally came together. And so yeah, I guess I did. It's hard to look at your own work that way. It's hard to, I can't step back far enough to take a look at my own work, but I'm going to take Scott's opinion because, these are very familiar with my work after years and years of working with me on the Batman titles. So I'm going to take his opinion as gospel. As far as Mary Kate, Levon's daughter, no, I don't really have plans of her like partnering up. But she's certainly tough. If you've been reading the books, she's never a girl hostage. She always manages to take care of herself, no matter how terrifying the situation. And she's got a little bit of a body count herself by now in the series. But no, she's not going to be dedicating her life to getting herself in trouble the way Levon did. I mean, Levon just doesn't really set out to be a vigilante crime fighter. It just turned out that way because he makes a lot of enemies and he makes a lot of trouble for himself. And he draws trouble like honey draws flies. So, but I do toy around with the idea of her possibly joining the military, probably the Marines someday, following in her father's footsteps in that way. But I haven't put a whole lot of thought to that and all the research that would involve. All right, I'm going to take a shot at this. Gamai Mba. Please tell me if I'm close. Hi, Chuck. Big fan of your work. I know you were a big fan of Westerns. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on Jonah Hex? Since you were mainly a DC guy, I'm surprised you never wrote him. Yeah, I like Jonah Hex when it first came out in Weird Western Tales. I never missed an issue. And, obviously it was... he was different than the other Western heroes at the time because he had a bit of a mean streak. And a lot of people think, well, it grew out of the spaghetti Westerns, but I never got a Italian spaghetti Western feel off of Jonah Hex. He was much more like the mean-spirited Westerns that were made either here in the United States or made in Spain by English production companies. Movies like The Hunting Party, Lawman, Chado's Land, Olzana's Raid, Valdez is Coming. And these were kind of like unsparingly bleak views of what the West was like. Very violent, often featuring amoral lead characters. And Jonah Hex fit right into that because there wasn't the sort of, weird distancing we get in an Italian Western that to me is the appeal of an Italian Western, that they're much closer in some ways to operas than they are to Westerns. And that sort of brought a new vitality to the genre for a while. But I think Jonah Hex was more based on stuff being produced in the United States and England in the 70s. You think, yeah, the English made a bunch of Westerns. Shalako, Sean Connery got to play a cowboy. So, but like I said, I never missed an issue. Now, why didn't I ever work on Jonah Hex? Well, that's the weird thing about DC Comics. Is unlike Marvel, DC they take all of their characters and they divide them up into fiefdoms, and so different editors are awarded a list of characters that they control, that they're in charge of. And the problem is that most freelancers never get to see the list. They don't know who to go to. You don't know who to pitch to. I would get a little bit of inside information, a couple of nudges from editors that I work with, like, hey, Joe Schlabotnik, he's editing Haunted Tank now. He's in charge of Haunted Tank, so if you want to pitch something. I don't know who was doing Jonah Hex at the time. And it could possibly be an editor that didn't care for my work. I mean, there were quite a few of them at DC. So, they had other ideas. And they certainly did have other ideas over the years. I think they just sort of peed in the pool with Jonah Hex, kind of diluted the character by adding like supernatural elements and, just unwelcome things that weren't part of the series originally. Putting the weird into Weird Western. But that's the reason. That was a peculiar thing at DC. I mean, if you want, back in the day when Shooter or Marv Wolfman were in charge, or not Marv Wolfman, that Tom DeFalco were in charge, you could just go to them and pitch something. And it could be any character in the Marvel Universe. And especially under Tom DeFalco's aegis, you could pitch directly to him. You go, well, I want to do a Khazar something with Khazar. Well, go to marketing, Tom would say. And if they say they can sell that, we'll do it. So, that was the pitch system. The pitch system at DC was, unless you were pitching something to one of the major group characters and you knew who were editing them, if you were looking for some, B-level, C-level character that hadn't been in publication for a while, like Angel and the Ape or Stanley and his Monster, the Inferior Five, I mean, you would have no idea who to pitch it to. And no one would help you. You could wander the halls going, I got a great idea for Challenges of the Unknown. Who do I send it to? And I don't know. I've said it before in these videos, there's a lot of weird things about DC. No wonder they had a comic called The House of Secrets. Marvel was the House of Ideas. DC was the House of Secrets. You never knew what the hell was going on there with all the weird rules and protocols. So, Matt Webster on Facebook. Hey, I haven't seen you ask for any questions for Ask Chuck Dixon in a while. We haven't been watching these videos then. But I have a question for your channel. Could you explain public domain and how people like yourself can use characters like Conan the Barbarian? Well, the reason, under United States copyright laws, which are different than the copyright laws in England, different than the copyright laws on the continental Europe, basically 70 years after an author dies, everything he wrote goes into public domain. So Robert E. Howard has been dead, quite a few more years than 70. And so all of the Conan he wrote, and all of the Solomon Kane, and all the Bran MacMorn, and all the Kull the Conqueror, and all the Breckenridge Elkin stories that he wrote are all up for grabs. You can republish them. You can adapt them into comics. You can adapt them into movies, whatever you want to do. And you can write new stories as long as you stay within the work that Robert E. Howard did on Conan. You can't be using characters that Marvel created or were created by Lynn Carter or L. Sprague de Camp or any of them. Now, when I was approached to write Conan novels, these were the restrictions. You can only do what Howard did. And I was only interested in what Howard did. I only ever liked the Conan stories that Howard did. I didn't like what anyone else did with Howard, which was my driving ambition, was to hew as close to Howard's work as possible. And Siege of the Black Citadel runs about the same word length as a Conan novella, like Hour of the Dragon. Road of Kings, it's. I didn't want to exceed Howard's length. I wasn't going to write fantasy by the pound, and I tried as much as possible to stay with Howard's language. My monitor, I completed the third novel about a month ago, but all around my monitor are Post-it notes where I've written down Robert E. Howard words to remind me to use Robert E. Howard words, and mostly action verbs like plunge, hack, dash, plummet, things like that. Wrench, lurch, hard action words. And, try to stick to his language as much as possible. And of course, obviously, try to stick as much as possible to his characterization of Conan. Maybe the Conan I write has a little bit more of a sense of humor, but that's up to you to decide, because I don't think what Conan says he means to be funny. It just comes out funny in context of the situation he's in, much like Frank Castle. But so that's the copyright law. It's pretty simple. 70 years after somebody dies, everything they wrote goes into public domain. And there's exceptions. I think if things are trademarked, like Tarzan, the different works go into public domain over time. So the early Tarzan novels, the early John Carter novels are now in public domain, but not the later ones. And no one's challenged this yet, but technically early stories of Batman and early stories of Superman are now in public domain. The problem here is for a writer or a publisher is so many of the things that are a popular element of those different franchises occurred later in those franchises. So you would have to write a Superman story with no Jimmy Olsen, no Perry Mason, no Brainiac. No, you couldn't do that yet. So those would be the restrictions there. But luckily, for me anyway, all of Howard's work was up for grabs, and I was able to explore any of it that I wished. So, Walt Kevin, do you have any thoughts on the black and white indie comics that were all the rage when you were starting to work in the industry? Any thoughts on some of the period's longer-lasting series like Usagi Yojimbo, Bone, or ElfQuest? Yeah, I mean, we have things like the the black belt radioactive hamsters. Sold like a house of fire. We call it the black and white glut. There were so many black and white titles, but readers wanted them. And what started the black and white glut? Well, it was the Ninja Turtles started the black and white glut. Eastman and Laird, as simple as this, they couldn't afford color. So they put out their comic in black and white. It became an enormous hit, became a comic book phenomenon. God bless these guys. They were very successful comic creators who, went on to fame and fortune and feature films, animation, toys, video games, all the rest of it. But it began as a simple black and white comic that had to be in black and white because they couldn't afford color publication. And you had the black and white comics and you had the mini comics. People would just go to the Xerox store and do these little mini comics. And they were popular for quite a while and sold briskly. But, in the black and white glut, characters that were created here with the Tick, for example. And I did one myself towards sort of the waning days of the black and white gold rush. I did this one-shot manga satire called Radio Boy. That I wrote, and I even penciled the lead feature, which was rescued by inker Jim Engel, a cartoonist extraordinaire, who actually turned it into a decent-looking comic book artwork, as you can see from this cover. This cover is drawn by me, but inked by Jim, who turns it into something special. But I can testify to the black and white glut and how popular it was, because up until this point, I'd only been in the business maybe not even 2 years when I did this. And this was the biggest royalty check I ever got. I mean, this was a 5-figure royalty check for this silly little comic. So I can only imagine what the Turtles guys and all the rest of these people were bringing in, because people were really hot for black and white comics. They were like the cool thing for a while. And then they weren't, because that's what happens, because these trends end, and they end overnight. Now, Usagi Yojimbo, Stan Sakai, it's an epic. It's terrific work. I've read a few of them. I was never a big follower of it. One of my kids is. He really likes Usagi Yojimbo, and I think he has a complete collection in one form or another. The original comics and the trades and all the rest of it, and collections. ElfQuest I never got into, because I've said it before, I'll say it again, not a big fantasy guy. But Richard Wendy Pini certainly, created a mini empire here. I mean, back in the 80s and into the 90s, they were superstars at conventions. And I can only imagine this book sold very, very well for them, and they did well by it. And it was, again, one feature of the black and white thing was it was creator owned. The big two weren't doing black and white comics. This was all creator-owned stuff. This was all garage band comics, and readers and fans were responding to it in a big way, and that was cool to see. Now, Bone, I remember Bone coming out. I thought it was very well done. Jeff Smith's an excellent cartoonist, but I just never got into it. I mean, I think I bought like the first 6 issues, and I read them, but it didn't engage me. I guess it just wasn't for me. I didn't quite get what the hell it was supposed to be. But extraordinarily popular for a very long time. And we can't forget Cerebus the Aardvark also was a huge phenomenon in the from the late 70s onward. And, actually, now that I think about it, predates Ninja Turtles. So really, I guess the black and white glut begins with the Aardvark. So, Hassan Pashal. I've been a dedicated comics reader for over 30 years now, and I can't understand their continuity. Is there something wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing. You're normal. If you did understand the continuity, there'd be something wrong with you. DC has, had more crises, I guess you pronounce it, and reboots and restarts, and it's madness. Look, I worked for DC Comics for 11 years, and I know I was, all exiled into the bad offices, but, every once in a while I'd write an issue of Justice League or a Superman thing, or, Green Lantern, Flash, whatever. I'd get out of the Batman ghetto. I'd get to leave Gotham and do other stuff. And I never understood any of this. And I worked in it. I mean, they paid me to write stories in this continuity, and I never got any of it. I don't understand any of it. The Earth 2, Earth 3, it's just nuts. And you throw in the whole multiverse thing, and then you start playing with it, New 52 and new 52, and forget the old 52. This is the brand new 52. Doing that over and over and over again, with flashpoints and, whatever else, end games, whatever they name the latest intercompany crossover. And these intercompany crossovers were generally done because they could make retailers understand how to buy them. And so eventually they were popular with readers because retailers would buy a lot of them. And here's a little secret. I don't think it's true anymore, but it was at one time. If you get your comic into the store, it would sell. So anything you could get to do to get the retailers to overorder to extend themselves meant more of your comics got to the stands, which meant more of your comics were still there on Saturday when the casual looky-loos came into the store. Because the diehard fans were there on Wednesday to get their fix. And if a book was a hit, on Saturday there wouldn't be any copies left. So your goal as a comic book publisher was to get them to order enough copies to last into the weekend. And then the retailers would be happy in the end because they sold more books, and the publisher's happy because they sold more books. And that's why they did crossovers, because it made it easier. Well, these, it's one of 12 books, and you got to order all 12 books, and you got to order the same of all 12 books. And so that was the whole point of doing it. But why DC made so many of their crossovers about their own continuity, this sort of navel-gazing, looking within kind of storylines, I don't get. Because it all seems like math to me, and I hate math. And how did you expect readers to follow this? You were going to lose, when you do these big overarching Uber stories, you lose casual readers entirely. So while you're pleasing the fan base, sometimes these cause you to shed readers, which is why once one of these crossovers was over, sales would self-correct on all of the titles, and they would go back to what they were selling before or lower. And I don't think anybody was really thinking about this long term as to why you would push these big, confusing, continuity-driven crossovers on people. But from what I can see, in the 2000s onward, every single crossover, the high concept was we're going to shake things up in the DC universe. Which, how is that a story? I don't get it. Where's the drama? Seth, I just finished watching your Q&A and really enjoy it. I would love to hear more about working under the Comics Code. The Comics Code was brought about in the 1950s, if you didn't know this, because everybody was up in arms because the comics were causing juvenile delinquency, rising crime rate. Kids were breaking windows and soaping up cars and throwing toilet paper at the trees. We can't have this. We can't have this. So they had to blame somebody, so they blamed the Comics Code. Or they blamed comic books. And there were Senate hearings, and there were books written, and PTA meetings, and church groups, and everybody, you know, they were burning comic books. And this is only a few years after World War II, where you think burning anything is kind of, you know, isn't this what we just fought against? So burning comic books, everybody getting upset, everybody trying to blame, you know, Superman and Batman for their problems. And so things, you know, the comic book companies realized they had to get together and do something to save their own butts, because so they came up with the Comics Code. I think it was John Goldwater at Archie who initially came up with it. And now up until then, Archie, MLJ Publications, they were just as bad as everybody else, with the horror comics and the war comics and the blood and the guts. And Atlas, they dove way deep into the horror, and their war comics were some of the grimmest around. I mean, it was like everybody was competing with EC for a race to the bottom to see how shocking they could make their comics. And even Harvey Comics, you know, publishers of Casper and Wendy the Witch, were doing these gruesome horror comics. Really, only DC and Dell stayed above the fray. They never went in for that stuff. And Dell created its own code and its own promise, because Dell was the biggest comic book company in America at the time, sold more books than anybody. And because they had never, you know, gotten down into the gutter with EC, they escaped a lot of this. And they had their own distribution system. They had their own printers. They, you know, when I was a kid, you would find DC Comics or Dell Comics in their own rack. And some drugstores only carried Dell Comics. And Dell made a big thing about a promise to parents that this will always be wholesome entertainment. We've never, you know, basically debased ourselves like all the other comic book companies. You know, we're not perverts and jerks and communists like they are. We're doing good, clean comics for kids. And as a result of that, over time, the result was that at Marvel, DC, and a number of companies simply went out of business. Hillman just stopped publishing comics. We don't want to hassle with any of this. So a number of companies just simply folded their tents and went back to publishing crossword puzzle books. But at DC and at Marvel and the other companies, what you had after the Comics Code was a bunch of creators who were terrified of doing anything that might gain attention or violate this new comic book code. And so the comics became very bland. They didn't know how to work within these parameters. And it's not really until, you know, Stan and Jack and Steve come along and figure out, you know, hey, we can do, you know, slightly more mature material than the bland pablum that we're doing. And all through this period, Dell was just doing what it did. I mean, they were doing, you know, well-constructed, entertaining comics, because they had never bothered with the gore and the gruesomeness and the weirdness. They just went on the way they went on, you know, and continued to be the biggest comic book selling comic book line in the United States, you know, until they weren't. So as far as working under the Comics Code, I never had a problem. I understood what it was. Every once in a while, you'd run into something. I remember on The Punisher, some of the artists would draw exit wounds. The Punisher would shoot somebody, and there would be an exit wound. And that was against the Comics Code. And so rather than have their art redrawn, they simply colored the exit wounds yellow, which didn't make any sense to me at all. But generally I was fine with it. I was fine with the rules, because I realized, you know, I'm aiming my comics at a precocious 10-year-old, and I got to stay within that sort of PG range. And I could tell perfectly good, entertaining, dramatic stories within that range. I didn't have a problem. I didn't feel a need to push the envelope. But a number of writers and artists did. They actively pushed against the Comics Code, which I couldn't see the point of it. It's not like it was going to bring in more readers. And generally, it just made it hot for your editor. And why would you want to, you know, get your editor in trouble? So, okay. Hey, I've had a lot of questions about conventions. There was one in the video prior or the one before that about, what's the proper etiquette? What are the proper manners when encountering a comic book professional? It's these elevated elite of comic book creators. How do you act around them? Do you genuflect? Do you call them sir and madam? All that stuff, which, which I assured you all is, most of us in the business are just as big a bunch of geeks as you are. So we're all equals. We all love this medium. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing what we do. You wouldn't be reading them. You wouldn't be buying them, and we wouldn't be working in them. We would have found more gainful, more regular employment. So, but I did a number of years ago write an essay, and I thought I'd share it with you now. I'd share with you the identity of the 7 deadly fans. There's a kind of fan that you don't want to be. And I'm sure that no one here, no one listening to me is one of these fans. And I think you'll recognize them because you go, if you go to conventions, you've seen some of these people. So, first up is a guy called the Surrogate. And he's usually a dad, and he's got his little kid along, and he pushes the kid toward the table, and the kid looks at you like you're a zoo animal. I mean, he doesn't know why he's there. But the whole time, the dad is assuring you that his child is your biggest fan. Little Kyle he's nuts for your comics. He can't stop reading your comics. And this kid's looking at me like he has no idea who I am. Now, why they do this just to get a comic book signed, I simply have no idea. But the whole time I'll be signing, the dad is assuring me that the kid's a big fan. And if the dad's really pushy, like a little league dad, he's like saying, ask Mr. Dixon a question. Tell Mr. Dixon how much you love his comics. And I can tell it's a lie. This kid he's been promised an ice cream cone or something if he's good. And that's all he's thinking about. That's all he cares about. He'd rather go over and look at the Lego display than stand there talking to me. So the next guy up, he's the mercenary, usually a comic dealer. This was more a phenomenon in the 90s when comics were, speculators were involved. And retailers had this idea that if their comic book was signed by a working comic book professional, that increased its value. I'm not sure that was ever true. But this guy would show up with, just piles and piles and piles of comics to sign. And he never had any questions. And sometimes he'd just leave them on your table and go back to his table. Now, a number of times I used this as a wedge to get a better deal buying vintage comics off the guy. But this became less and less interesting to me as I bought less and less older comics. I just, wasn't buying that much anymore. And so I got the idea of putting out a charity jar and shaming guys like this into putting, $20, $40 in there. If I'm going to sign 100 comics for you, you're going to pay somebody, either the Salvation Army or, Hurricane Relief or something. But you're not getting away from here, without putting something in the jar, my friend. But yeah, like I said, I haven't seen the Mercenary too much recently. Of course, I haven't gone to a lot of cons recently. The next one up, I've never experienced this, but I've seen it. The Fiancé. I've sat at tables with comic book creators who were good-looking guys, and they attract women. Now, when I first started going to comic book conventions, the only women you ever saw were possibly the wife of a retailer. You never saw female comic fans. But in the 90s, when the money was there, you started seeing women show up. And I've been there where, they need to complete the image they're trying to present to the guy they're talking to is a stripping pole. And most of the time, most of the pros that I've been around who've been approached this way simply ignore them. But it is a phenomenon, and I have seen it, the Fiancé. This guy is the Wannabe. Now, I understand. It's hard to get in the comic book business. And a lot of people show up at the comic conventions hoping to maybe get some employment, get somebody to notice their work and everything else. I get it. I dig it. That's fine. But this guy, the wannabe, just is obnoxious about it, you know, and he wants to know what you think of his work. And really, he just wants to hear praise. He doesn't want any criticism. And you get this idea of resentment, like, you know, he wants to take your job. You know, why do you have your job when he's so much better than you? but he tries to be charming and tries to be interesting and fails at every attempt. And this is the guy who's, you know, dropping off scripts and pitches and Xeroxes off at tables and just simply won't take no for an answer. But like I said, you know, if you're looking to break into the comic book industry and you're sincere about it, I certainly will talk to you. You know, like I said, I'm sympathetic. I was the guy on the other side of the table trying to get work, but there's a way to go about it, and it's not the way that the wannabe goes about it. Then there's the character. This is a guy who shows up at your table dressed as a character that you've worked on, and he just sort of stands there waiting for your reaction. He's sort of like, well. And I never know how to react. Am I supposed to treat you? Am I supposed to say, like, you know, nice costume? Or am I supposed to act like you are the character? You know, how far is this charade going? And I'm never really sure. Particularly when the person has a mask covering their entire face, so I can't see any emotion. So I just have no idea how to react. The best I can do, and this seems to make them more happy than anything else, is to offer to pose for a picture with them. And that seems to make them happy. And I get a bunch of wacky con pictures to show off to people. Okay, this guy is the one question fan. And the one question fan is a guy, I've had a few of these over my career, and they have one question they want answered, but they just don't want it answered once. They want it answered over and over and over again. You know, what was going to happen in Airboy 51? What did you think of the Birds of Prey TV show? And it's like, you know, I've given you an answer to this same question at 19 different cons. Now, this isn't to say, like, I'm tired of hearing the same question over and over again. Because I do. I get a lot of the same questions over and over again. And I'm fine with that. Because generally, it's the first time a fan's met me. They're trying to strike up a conversation, and they think of the most obvious questions to ask. And I really don't mind. I really don't. It's not like I roll my eyes, like, oh, God, got to explain how I created Bane again. No, because you paid to get in. You're at the table. You showed an interest in my work, and you asked me to tell you something that you're curious about. I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to be fine with that. But the one question fan can drive you nuts, particularly the one question fan who has a question about something that you have nothing to do with. They just have a general question about comics, you know, in general rather than in particular. Like, you know, why don't they use Red Tornado more? I mean, I don't know. I don't know why I've never written that character. I have no idea. And then some one question fans, there's one in particular I've run into in recent years, wants to know basically why I don't change the industry. Like I have the juice, like I'm some sort of lazy bastard. Just get off your sofa and do this. And I was like, I don't have control. I don't own these characters. I can't do that. But what I got to wonder is, you know, what's this person like at home? They've just got one thing on their mind. I mean, literally one thing. But they're not as bad as the scary fan. I think every comic book creator has one scary fan. Writers like Neil Gaiman and Garth Ennis probably have hundreds. Alan Moore probably could fill an entire convention with his scary fans. What the scary fan is, he's generally obsessed with your work, and he knows way more about you than almost anybody. It's really strange. I had a guy who used to if I did a show in New York, would show up. And the guy was always bathed in sweat. And he had prison muscle. You know, this guy looked like he'd done some time and had plenty of time to work out. And he never blinked. And I always thought, well, he never blinked because he wasn't sure if he closed his eyes when he opened them, would the world still be here? I mean, that's how nuts this guy was. But I don't know what it says about me. He was always fascinated with me. He would literally pull a chair up on the other side of the table. He would get a chair somewhere and sit down in front of me. And he's the only fan that's ever done that. And then he would just stay there for the duration. And he would comment on what other fans were asking me. And weirdest of all, he would correct me if he felt I said something wrong. And he would use reference. You know, like, that's not what you said in Comics Interview, April, 1987. So a bit freaky. But then after a while, I didn't see him anymore. And I just assumed he died in a knife fight arguing over who drew Rogue best. All right. Story time. An awful lot of you, I made a little hint about an argument I had with James Earl Jones. And enough of you were curious, I thought I'd tell the story. Once upon a time, back in the 70s, I worked at an ABC affiliate in Philadelphia, Channel 6, home of Action News. And no, I was not in master control. I wasn't talent. I wasn't in production. I was a janitor. And if you know anything about janitors, you know that they're the fly on the wall. Nobody notices the janitor. He's emptying the trash. He's buffing the floor. They just act like he's not there. And then people would act like I wasn't there. So consequently, I got to see these absolutely amazing things. Absolutely amazing things. And hear amazing things. The stories I could tell about working at Channel 6. Just incredible. And I was a young kid with a dream, comic fan. I mean, I wanted to work in comics. I didn't want to be a janitor all my life, obviously. And I got in good with the producers, a lot of the producers of the show that were being done live at Channel 6. And they would let me know what celebrities were coming in. Like, Steve Allen's going to be in on Thursday. Buster Crabbe, he's going to be here next Wednesday. And I would bring in things for them to sign. And generally, that all went great. Well, it always all went great until James Earl Jones. So James Earl Jones was in to promote something. Now, this was like December 1977. This is a few months after Star Wars came out. And everybody knew it was the biggest hit of the year. Nobody realized what a phenomenon that it would become. But here comes James Earl Jones. And of course, I bring in a picture of Darth Vader. I'm Mr. Jones, would you sign my picture of Darth Vader? And James Earl Jones says, no. And he's smiling. He's very nice about it. He never got mean or nasty, but he said no. And I said, well, why not? He says, well, that's not me. And of course, I'm a, artless, tactless geek. I said, of course it's you. Everybody hears your voice. When they think of Darth Vader, they hear you. And he goes, yes, I understand that, he said, but it's not me in the costume. That's another actor. And I don't want to sign a picture, another actor in it, of another actor. Now, I mean, I've autographed all kinds of stuff. I've autographed all kinds of comics. I've autographed all kinds of things in my career. And I've never once ever refused to sign something if someone insisted that I sign it. I have all the time have comics put down in front of me I had nothing to do with. And I used to explain, hey, I didn't work on this. And I found out that 100% of the time, the person putting it on the table didn't care if I worked on it or not. And so now I just sign them. I don't do that. But James Earl Jones was sticking to his guns. Now, maybe in years to follow, he would willingly sign Darth Vader pictures. I'm sure he got asked a bajillion times to sign pictures of Darth Vader. And I would assume he eventually just gave in. He didn't want to have that same stupid conversation that he had with the goofball in the orange jumpsuit that he had back in 1977. He didn't want to have that conversation over and over again. But I did not get a signature. But I will say he was polite. He explained his position. He never got angry, never got annoyed. But I realized I was, pressing a little too hard. And, well, I probably had trash cans empty. If you want to reach me, if you're James Earl Jones and want to reach me, explain yourself further. You can contact me at Bruno Bookstore at gmail.com. Bruno Bookstore at gmail.com. It's the most reliable way to reach me. And while I have you, if you're still here, go on Discord, go to spinrack.io. The community is growing. And I was told today by our PR guy that a lot of you are joining after hearing me talk about it here. He said we are seeing a growth at the channel. Now, what can you do at spinrack.io on Discord? Well, you can join a growing comic book community, and it's really, really cool. I'm utterly sincere here. We started it out with different sections on penciling, layouts, inking, writing, lettering, all the different crafts that go into making a comic, and we invited people to show us their work. There's essays there. Graham does some, demonstration stuff, and so it's Graham, Nolan, and I are there, and hopefully, certainly one day other creators will join us there, other professional creators, and we began seeing people submit stuff. Now, there's tryout scripts. There are scripts specifically written for this Discord channel for you to try your talents out on. Lettering, inking, coloring, whatever it is you want to do in comics. You can try it out there. And but the most heartening thing I see is that it actually is becoming a community. A lot of the people at the site are beginning to talk to each other and are beginning to talk about collaborating with each other on their own comic book projects. And I think that's kind of exciting. So it's kind of neat to see. So if you want to get in on the fun, get in on the action, it's a direct way to have contact with Graham and I if you're a creator, or if you're just curious and want to look around, see what we're doing, please stop by. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for liking. And I'll see you all down the road.